Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything, and I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. This week, we are joined by my friend Becca. I can call you my friend now, right? We've had breakfast together.
Absolutely. We have.
But before we get started, a reminder that this podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. We always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. And Becca's going to talk about how that works, which I think will be exciting. She is an epigenetics and human performance coach, which I didn't even know was a thing until we had breakfast together. So Becca and I met on a beauty counter trip, which, by the way, is always the best place to meet like-minded people. I always meet like the coolest people. And you partner with my good friend and lovely previous guest of the show, Cassie Joy Garcia of Fed and Fit. And when we were talking, you and I, at this breakfast, my mind was blown on where your wellness journey had taken you in terms of both personal performance as well as becoming a coach to help others from an genetics standpoint. And we did a super deep dive into genetics, epigenetics, and social determinants of health for the very last episode with Sarah, 499 of season 2, and it was hugely important to both of us, Sarah and I, and listeners. You all voted on it as being the show that you wanted us to cover, and subsequently became one of your favorite episodes of all time because you shared it and the downloads on it told us that you like the show. So if you haven't listened to that show yet, definitely go back and give it a listen. It's a great follow on to this show. And it made me completely fascinated to hear about Becca's work because I was the reason that I wanted to talk about that show. I'm sure, Becca, you've listened to the show. You told me you listened to the show.
I
And
did.
you heard me talk about like how fascinated I was by all of the components, including like what we don't yet know about epigenetics and like what is stored in our DNA for generations. Like there's so much emerging science and information on this. And I think being able to tap into that for your own optimization and well being is just a fascinating concept that I hadn't really considered. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to welcome you and have you be on the show to talk more about that because it is your life's mission to help listeners feel more confident and empowered in providing them essentially a blueprint for limitless wellness, as you call it, and leveling up mindset through e- an epigenetic lens. And I think it will be incredibly powerful to a lot of listeners who, work on a lot of different aspects of their health and well being, tweaking so many things about their lifestyle, but having actual science or testing or any of those kinds of things to kind of guide us is so helpful. So I'm excited to introduce you to the whole view. Yeah, the whole view. I almost said the wrong name again. I keep doing that. But for listeners, if you want to go check Becca out, you can find her at mindbodygenes.com and under the same name on socials. And we'll talk more about your resources and all those kinds of things throughout the show and at the end. But Becca, can you tell us more about yourself and what kind of brought you to being an epigenetics coach?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on here, first of all. And yes, I'm so glad we are friends now. I've been following you for longer than I've met you. So I just think this is so cool. Yeah. So I have always been on kind of a personal health journey. I think a lot of us can relate to just diving into things as we hear about them. I had my first son, 11 years ago, and I started doing the thing where you like swap out stuff in your house and you like start to make better choices and you kind of do a little mini dive on that. And then fast forward to having my daughter about 5 years ago. And I really took like a health turn of my own. I just started to not feel like myself. I started to feel like something was wrong. And I think that A lot of us can relate to that because we'll go to the doctor, we'll go, get checked up and we'll be like, something's off. And we know ourselves most. We know ourselves like in and out. And I just kept hearing like, "Oh no, you're just tired. You have kids. Like you're a mom. Like it's okay. You're just gonna feel like that. It's hormones, it's this, it's that." And I just didn't feel listened to. And so I kept digging and diving and, doing my own research and then finally found out that I was suffering with Hashimoto's. So I had an autoimmune condition. And it felt like just amazing to have answers for once. And it felt like finally, okay, this explains some of my symptoms, the fatigue and just, kind of getting sick at every turn. It was really new to me. And then I started working with a functional medicine practitioner, really dove into my health, got made leaps and bounds, really like started to heal through, listening to people like you, reading cookbooks and like going into the lifestyle stuff, like really diving into what paleo looked like for me, what it looked like to, reduce my stress and all that stuff. And I know a lot of people can relate to this as well. When you start diving into your health, you start kind of finding more things that are wrong. Like it's kind of a ripple effect. And so it felt after like 2 years of doing that, getting my autoimmune condition in remission, which was really awesome, but just kind of like finding things like it would be candida and then it would be like, oh, you've got Epstein-Barr virus and oh, you have this and you have that. It would be one thing after another. And I started to feel like in my core that what we were doing at this point was just throwing darts at the wall to see what was going to stick. And I started to feel very uncomfortable with the fact that no matter what we were going to do, we were going to find something wrong with me. And I say that with big air quotes because, like, you're always going to find something to improve on, right? And I just felt in my core that there was another way. I was like, there's just something pulling me to another way of looking at my health, looking at myself as this person who is healed and who is going to continue to be healing for the rest of her life, but also looking at it through a lens of not being a broken person. And so I actually stumbled into epigenetics. I really did. I stumbled into it through social media and started reading all the things. I'm a big reader. I love to read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and I love to read articles and journals, and I just like dove in headfirst. Also, Enneagram 3 here. So I like when I go into something, it is like, I'm in for life. And I just got so fascinated, like yourself. Like it's completely fascinating because it's it's still kind of a new field, right? It's been around, but we're still just kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg when it comes to everything with the genes and what that means and how far back it goes. And then also how far forward it goes into generations. So I did my research. I read the books. I read Dirty Genes by Dr. Ben Lynch. And I just was like, okay, this is a really good starting point. And then I ended up finding my own epigenetics coach. And I connected with somebody and I did my genetic blueprint. Like I did my genetic blueprint with a coach and I went through the process on my own. And what I found was just completely eye-opening. It was like all the mic drop moments. It was all of the, missing pieces of the puzzle that I was looking for because finally I was able to see myself like, for lack of a better word, on paper. I was able to see myself, not just what a test said I was looking like at that time of the month. It was like, not just what my hormones were peaking at that season. It was what am I wired for? Like, what am I truly wired for at my core? And it felt like coming home to myself a little bit. And so I really, again, kind of did the thing that I, love to say that I love to do, which is I said, I'm going in on this. Like, I actually feel how much it's impacted my life. And I cannot see myself not helping others with this. I have to help other people with this. And so I connected with, the person that helped me in the company that I went through. And I said, I want to become a coach. And they offered training and programs. And so I pretty much almost instantly, like after I saw results for a few months, I went into a certification program. And the rest is really history. I mean, of course, it takes time to get certified and to study and to learn all the things. I joked that I felt like I was definitely back in school, but for something I had no idea I was ever going to study in my life. I have a hospitality background, so it was just such a flip for me. But at the same time, not really. Like I've always been about taking care of people, and this felt like the ultimate way to take care of people. So that's how Mind Body Genes was really formed. And I continue to see the lasting effects of my own health journey. I've never felt better. And when I say that, I mean, it's not about, it's not about an appearance. It's not about a size. It's about how I feel inside. It's about how I feel in my own skin. And like knowing myself fully gave me that freedom and gave me that permission to feel like that.
I love that you said it felt like you were coming home to yourself. And I feel like a lot of us can relate to this idea that getting into our DNA, getting into our genetics, kind of seeing our culture, seeing our history, especially for me with my mom having been adopted, like learning more about these things definitely feels like emotional home, like physical home, emotional home. I think that there's a great kind of analogy and metaphor there, but also the sense that it gave you to feel comfortable in your own skin is also like being home in yourself and not feeling like, an outsider or being at war with yourself and all these kinds
Yeah.
of things, which I know we've talked about before and would take us in a different direction. So let's get into the nitty gritty of exactly what all this is. In episode 499, we defined epigenetics is identified as the genes whose variations are associated with a disease and is just the first step in linking genetics and health. Understanding the mechanisms by which the gene is expressed and how it is influenced by other genes, proteins, and the environment is becoming increasingly important. So I know that you agree that it's becoming increasingly important, but I'd love to hear how you define epigenetics.
Yeah. So I define epigenetics because it's easy to read that sentence and go, okay, get it. But a lot of people are like, what does that still mean? Right. It's confusing a little bit. So to me, epigenetics is the study of how your body responds to its environment and the impact that has on your genes. So simply put, it's truly what we eat, what we put on our skin, our thoughts, our interactions, and everything about our lifestyle, and those things are more important than we could have ever imagined. Because we have the power to change what our DNA does, right? We can't change what it is, but we can change what it does and how it acts. We aren't tied to a particular outcome like we had thought before many, many years ago. And that truly feels like the ultimate freedom, knowing that you have control over that.
Yeah, I'm my mind is like, you ever see that cartoon where it's like a black and white person and then coming out of their head is like this giant exploding rainbow? That's my brain when I think about genetics, when I think about like that the eggs that my grandmother had influenced who and how my DNA is expressed today, and that the experiences that I've had will impact like future great grandchildren that I'll never meet, right? Like that's
Absolutely.
fascinating to me. And when we think about it from the perspective of the incredible amount of things that we know are in our environment today. So I don't just mean toxic pollution and phthalates and all the things that are like tangible. I also mean like the political stress that we feel or the burden and overwhelming anxiety of like sitting in traffic and that doing that day in and day out, or the lack of sleep because we live in like a hustle culture, right? Like all of these things play into how our body is then expressing itself and impacting our future self, but also the people who follow. And so I
Absolutely.
know
It gives me chills.
I know it's and what's interesting to me is beyond just like my original interest having an adopted mother and more about the pieces of us that we didn't know, right? I'm also fascinated from the perspective of we hear so often that it's nature or nurture, right?
Mhm.
Is it something you're predisposed to, or is it something that happened from the way that you were raised and being a foster parent and seeing the ability of someone to overcome some of the things and traumas and experiences that they've had. And then some of the things being in their genes or these kinds of things has also made me like even more interested in that because I'm seeing it play out in someone that I love in a way that I couldn't have anticipated or don't know the background on. So I would love if you could kind of share more about where, like, what is this blueprint that you come up with and what does it really tell us in terms of like, how does the testing target specific areas to help you feel like you know more about yourself? Or how do you figure this all out? Because I think it's such a broad concept. Like once you kind of understand what the definition is, you realize that it's infinite in terms of the effects that it has. And so how do you even like put like a rope around that? How do you even box that in? How do you define that and research that and come up with a test for that? Like, what does all of that involve?
Yeah, yeah. It's super fascinating, especially when we think about just the different avenues you can go down. I mean, even if we talk about epigenetic testing and genetic testing, like you can go down so many different like rabbit holes. Like you can find a test wherever you want to look. And the one specifically, like the blueprint that I do, it involves correlation with lifestyle factors specifically. So we look at 6 different areas that are a pretty broad spectrum of what we're coming into contact with, what we're daily like influencing every day, which are nutrition, supplementation, environmental detox, sleep, as we talked about, athletic performance, and hormones. So, of course, like we could come up with a huge comprehensive list. Those are the 6 main areas that we focus on. And there's hundreds and hundreds of genes that go into that. We have a vast array that we use that basically pulls all of those genes into the area that it impacts. So you will see, like anybody that's done their blueprint or wants to do their blueprint will see that there are genes that correlate on all of those areas. There are genes that correlate with more than just nutrition. There are genes that affect sleep and nutrition and athletic performance and all of the things because it's not just that like with genetics and epigenetics, we can't take a very like narrow view. We have to take a big bird's eye view. We have to look at how all of the genes work together. It's kind of like this symphony or this blueprint. And so what I usually recommend with people that want to get into this and want to like figure this out for their life and like put that rope around it, like you said, is I recommend that they start with the 3 pretty much foundational panels, which are nutrition, supplementation, and detox. It's really hard to pick like it's like picking, your favorite, I don't know, favorite flower. It's like really hard. It's like, what do you say? But those 3 are going to give you a really big foundational overview. Nutrition is huge. We know that because food is life, right? I'm like a huge foodie, love food, love figuring out ways that I can eat food that is delicious and yummy and supports my body, but also because we have a lot of control over this area, so to speak. We have, there are those of us that have a lot more resources to control this area. But then if we think about it, we're eating a lot of the day. Like a lot of the day is spent eating. We wake up, we have breakfast, there's snacks. Like our life does revolve around food. And so I always suggest definitely starting with nutrition. And we often feel the most lost in this area too. I feel like, if you've ever been at the grocery store or like doing your shopping and you're like in a season of life where you're just like, what do I even want to make? Or what even like does my body want? Maybe it's for the person that doesn't yet know like how to intuitively listen to what their body is wanting, right? And so it can feel very daunting, nutrition as a whole, just in our lives. So I feel like this is a great place to start, especially when it comes up to all the information out there. I feel like we don't have a lack of information. We have an abundance of information when it comes to things that we can do in our life to improve. And that's great. It's awesome that we have that all at our fingertips, but sometimes it ends up being a little bit noisy. So I always tell people that having your own specific genetic blueprint helps you to kind of cut through the noise, figure out what's best for you instead of doing what is trending. And look, I will tell you, I'm all about like jumping on trends and bandwagons sometimes because they're fun. They're so fun, right? And I have been the first to like, ooh, let me try that because everyone's talking about it. But sometimes you just need to have that like baseline of returning to what does my body actually need? And then you don't have to really listen to everything because that can be overwhelming in itself, is actually like feeling like you have to do what everyone else is doing because it's trending and popular instead of knowing and having the knowledge to go, oh yeah, that would actually work for me because I know my genes. Or no, you know what? That wouldn't be the best thing for me because I know what my genes say and I know how my body would respond to that. So, yeah, and then the other 3, oh sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I feel like also I see how this works really well as we all seek to do kind of N equals one testing for ourselves, right? This is a way to help you kind of pick that off, so to speak, right? Like you're given a blueprint of what that looks like, which then narrows down all that noise that you're calling it, right? Like all these other things that are out there that you might have kind of tried to test for yourself. And I can also see how, from an intuitive eating perspective, how this might also guide you, right? If you're
Mhm.
on a journey to quit the, you know, diet culture dogma, if you have a guide that says, like, this is what it looks like your genes are saying could be optimize how you feel your best, then it's not like, there's a guilt or a shame if you're eating outside of that blueprint or something like that.
Yep.
But I can see how it would be incredibly helpful if you're trying to find that intuitive place within yourself to kind of have kind of a go to when you're thinking about these things, whether it's meal planning or whether it's identification of emotional eating, which we've talked about before. It's not a problem with that. It's to be self aware and
Yeah.
to know, okay, if I am going to partake in something. So for me, I'll equate it to alcohol because I feel like there's a lot less shame somehow associated with alcohol than ice cream. So let's just put
This is
that
so true.
put that over here for a second. But like for me, I've realized that I do not feel well with alcohol. The idea
Mm.
always sounds really great to me, and I want to have fun with everybody else that's drinking. But I know from, multiple experiences that I'm going to feel anxious when I try to go to bed, that I'm not going to get a good night's sleep, that I'm going to not feel my best. I'm going to feel dehydrated in the morning no matter what I do. And that dehydration can lead to a whole host of other things, from vertigo to headache to crankiness to all these things, all because it started with alcohol. And if I hadn't been paying attention to those things, maybe I wouldn't have realized that, right? Because I don't drink very often. I'm able to kind of say, oh, that's definitely what that is. And so that would kind of be expressed in a way that would guide me to, oh, pay attention to this, right? Like it's not necessarily telling you don't ever have another alcoholic beverage again, but be aware that like this is not going to make you feel your best. Am I
Yeah.
describing that kind of
You are spot
clearly?
on. Yeah, and that's a great example. For example, like methylation status and your MTHFR status, that all goes into how you methylate, and alcohol is a big one, right? And you're like, "Oh, yeah, I got that."
I've got both of those. Yep.
Yep. And then there's also, like, the histamine factor. There's a lot of people who are very sensitive to histamines, and alcohol is going to be very high in histamine no matter which kind you choose. And for somebody who can find that out about themselves and realize, like, oh, that's why after I drink, I get these symptoms of like allergies. I get a flushing of my cheeks. I get stuffy. I feel like junk the next day because, you know, it's all the histamines. And then you kind of start to put the pieces of the puzzle together and you're like, oh, that's why that doesn't make me feel good. Or, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a lot of people who will find out something about their grain sensitivity, their glutamate sensitivity, and they will just light bulbs will go off and they'll say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that's why I felt that way after I eat certain foods. And then they're just like, they have that freedom. And I will be the first to tell you, like, I teach my clients empowered eating. Like, it is not about being perfect and it's not about eating perfectly for your genes. It's about knowing what your genes want. And then if I go out to eat and have, a bucket of chips and salsa because that sounds super delicious to me, then I know that's not, my body's not going to feel its best, but I have tools. And there's always tools to you hear a lot about this biohacking and this like culture of like wanting to like biohack your wellness, but I think it can be more simplified than just like biohacking to become like these machines and these like robotic, like healthy gurus. It's more about like, okay, we have the tools, we have the knowledge. And then when we do something that our body doesn't love, we give ourselves the grace. Like that's almost a biohack in itself. We give ourselves the permission to follow our intuition and to really just live our life.
I love that as a biohack. I'm gonna use that in the future. I'll give you credit.
Awesome.
Okay, so you had other areas you were gonna go into before I jump
Yeah, the other 3, because I talked about the first, like, the foundational ones, and those are really impactful and for a lot of reasons, and we will deep dive into some of this, but the other 3 are sleep, athletic performance, and hormones, and I feel like those are great, and sleep people are like, "Oh, why is sleep not a foundational one?" The good news is we can always get some of those sleep genes, like I said, they're in other panels, we can pull some of those sleep genes, like the COMT, we can pull those out of other panels and see. Sleep is one of the easiest things to really like let fall by the wayside, but it's also one of the easiest things to optimize with the genes because it's really impacted by those other 3. It's really impacted by nutrition. It's really impacted by environmental detox and supplementation because of the fact that it's like that, the rising tide, like it raises all of the ships. And so it really does help when you're doing that. And you asked about how does somebody do this? What's the tangible, hey, I want to look into my genes. What do I do? The best way is by working with an epigenetics coach like myself because they're trained to read the genes. It's, when you pull up a genetic blueprint, it does look kind of like Greek. Like it just looks, it's like letters and numbers and markers and the single nucleotide polymorphisms, the SNPs. And with an untrained eye, it looks very hard to comprehend. I've had clients come to me from taking, like those direct to consumer tests. I don't want to necessarily name them, but you can go buy them for like really cheap. They usually have deals around the holidays and they're like, buy 3 genetic test kits and learn all about your genes. And that's cool. And I've done the ancestry.com thing. That's really neat to learn about. But when it comes to like the genetic lifestyle markers and all of that, it gives you kind of the genes, but it doesn't give you the interpretation and the full comprehensive picture. So people are left going, okay, great. I have these genes and I have my genetic blueprint, but I don't know what it means. And so usually we end up having to rerun it and kind of look at it through a different lens. So the great news about this kind of test is it's just a simple cheek swab. It's not a go to the lab, do a bunch of blood work. It's a saliva test and it's done from your own home. And so people are able to do that no matter where they live, right? They do not have to be local to me or live in a certain place. We actually do it all over the world, not just in the US. So Canada, everywhere. And it comes with a prepaid and secure envelope that goes straight to the lab. And the best thing about the test, in my honest opinion, is that there's no retesting because, coming from a person that has gone through the gamut of functional medicine testing in the past, there's nothing wrong with that. And they're very insightful and very helpful during certain seasons. But you don't have to retest every 3 to 6 months to learn what changes because you're getting the foundational information, you're getting the blueprint, your data doesn't change. So no matter your age too, like, I have clients that are 5 and then clients that are 80 because it doesn't matter where you're at in your life. You can still learn about your genes. It is truly that one-time test for life that you can continue to optimize on. You do the work to help optimize and feel your best. And the genes are there. The genes are always there for you. You can always return back to them.
I think that's like a fascinating concept. The one question that I have that I've heard from others about this kind of testing is the concern that then DNA is somehow in public databases for public records.
Right.
Could someone use, for example, a fake name or something like that? Like, how does it work?
Absolutely. Yeah, if there is any concern over that, clients can use a different name. They can even put in a different, birth year. Like all it's asking for the information to register your kit is your name, your email address. You could create a different one if you feel like uncomfortable about that birth year. And then of course, like male or female chromosome, like that's what it's asking for. And yeah, I've had some people ask about that because they've gone through companies like a 23andMe and they've been like, that just seems so like sketch, or it just seems like, where's my data going? And I will send them information on where our lab is. And like we use a lab that's all they do. That's all they do is the test kits that we send them and also like longevity test kits to learn about like their true age and like epigenetic aging. And so it goes from their house, the client's house, to the lab. And then the database is secure to the coach and the client. The client and the coach are the only people that have access to that information. And the raw file is so encrypted that like if you didn't know what to do with it and didn't know how to build a report like you're doing with working with a coach, then somebody's going to look at it and it truly does look like computer code.
Okay, so once you have this blueprint with a prospective client, how do you then go about working with them to implement changes and help optimize their life accordingly? So, I guess what I'm asking is what and how does that correspond to real life? And, I'm thinking of your reference to working with functional medicine in the past where it felt like everything you were doing, you were diving into, okay, now what's wrong with me? Let's try this other thing. Okay, now, it's still things aren't great. Let's keep digging and digging. And whether or not that ends up being helpful for someone in the long run, there's a lot of like anxiety and stress and like all of this multiple rounds of feeling like you're not well, which I think definitely plays a role in how you're physically feeling as well. So I'm like imagining both what I've been through, what you've been through, and I'm sure listeners have been through in terms of like, okay, I just had to put all of it aside and be like, I'm going to do what feels good to me. And I'm going to
Mhm.
stress a lot less around what I'm putting in my body, and I'm gonna focus on, like, listening to my body and trying to feel good. And so what I do like about this is that it is also about, like, feeling good, right? Like, helping
Mhm.
you feel good and not getting lost in the cycle of, like, what's wrong and diving into that. But also, when you're going through the coaching part of it, what does that look like in terms of guidance from you, supplements, nutrition, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can take the nutrition panel first and kind of dive into that. We truly are learning in that panel what foods work for your body. And so when I'm with a client, we talk about potential food triggers and we talk about them in a way of it being potential, right? Like this does not mean it is not a food sensitivity test. It's not going to show you that don't eat onions again because they're causing you distress. Like it's not going to show you that. It's going to show you, your body's preferences of fats. Like what does your body like to do with saturated fat, with monounsaturated fat, with polyunsaturated fat? What is your body like for ratios? Like, how does your body respond to fiber? How does your body respond to carbohydrates? Your ideal macro ratios. I always tell my clients this is not about giving you macros and saying, here, go do this, follow this, put it in an app. This is about like your body likes to have a higher fat diet. Your body is wired for, this this amount of complex carbohydrates because we actually have those codes built into our DNA where it can tell us, like your body does well over 150 carbs. Maybe you're the person that was told, like, oh, go low carb. It's great for you. Like, go keto. Well, if your body is coded for 150 to 250 grams of carbohydrates a day, like that's not going to make you feel your best. And so that kind of knowledge is something that usually gives people usually like sigh and they're like, oh, like, they're just kind of usually saying, "Wow," like, "Thank you," because it's not confusing anymore. And when it comes to things like you were talking about intuitive eating, we learn about hunger and satiety cues. We learn about hunger and satiety triggers. We learn about, like, how you're wired. If you are a person who is genetically wired for food addiction, that's knowledge, and that's okay, and it's kind of permission to say, your brain works like that. Like your brain and your body is wired to like, if you want to have some chocolate, like give yourself some chocolate because your body's wired to crave it and then to go get it. And then it gives them that sense of relief, takes the guesswork out, like we've talked about, to so many daily activities and routines. Whereas maybe you're the person that's sitting at your desk like, oh, I'm craving chocolate. Like I shouldn't have that for whatever reason you heard that you shouldn't have chocolate, right? Whoever told you that, or you're listening to something, instead of just going up and getting some chocolate and finding one that works for you based on what your genes are saying about other factors. That's just a very simple example. There's so many more like sugar craving insights and things like that. But, when it comes to, let's say, sleep, because that's very interesting to a lot of people, you can learn about your specific circadian propensity, the way that your body does sleep, you know, whether it's prone to disruption, whether you are somebody that moves around a lot in your sleep. Some of these things are like, oh, yeah, I definitely knew that because my partner tells me all the time I'm kicking them in my sleep or something like that. But it's confirmation. And then the supplement panel, I think, is probably one of the most fascinating ones because I've seen people just really change their life in a way of maybe they're the person that has the pill bottles lined up on the counter because they're like, I love taking supplements and I just want to like take supplements for everything that I hear out there that's good for my body. But then when they learn about their specific needs for supplements, whether it's how they convert things, if they are somebody that doesn't convert vitamin A from the inactive to the active form properly, but they're taking the wrong form of it for them, then it kind of feels like a waste of money and also time. Whereas they can streamline what they're taking. Vitamin D, like I know we have a really like great article on vitamin D and all of that. We learn about not only like the genetic association with vitamin D, like how are you wired to have vitamin D in your body, your specific sunlight response. Some people don't convert from sunlight very well. And if they're going out in the sun every time, they don't feel good because they're like, I need some vitamin D, but maybe their genes aren't wired like that. It's a different option for them. And then how they respond to vitamin D testing, because that's really important too, is knowing how we respond to certain tests because we may be getting the wrong ones at the doctor when we're doing our yearly physical, when we're doing that stuff. So it kind of gives you just a really streamlined approach. You basically everything you need and nothing you don't. That's kind of how I look at it. And that gives a lot of people that breath of fresh air when it comes to their health.
So you mentioned a lot of things that wouldn't have occurred to me as something you could see through epigenetic testing. And that's where I want to like geek out and my brain turns into this exploding rainbow. What are some of the common like genetic variants and different kinds of coding that you're seeing in these blueprints that are kind of unique to people or that would affect someone's health in their own kind of like personal experience, but that you're seeing across the spectrum of those that you work with. And I think I'm kind of especially interested because I'm also curious from the perspective of like how that plays out in family in terms of like broad spectrum DNA that if I were to determine, for example, that I do really well with fiber, I don't do really well with alcohol, right? Like all of these things that I've determined about myself, how can I then take that to my mother who I know is listening because
Mhm.
she loves epigenetics and she's going to geek out on this stuff and be like,
I love that.
Mom, also you need to dip into this and go ham on fiber and lay off the booze, right? Like
Right.
what are you seeing in those actual results that you're getting for people?
Yeah. What's cool, and this will also blow your mind and give you a ton of rainbows coming out of your brain because it's about to be crazy. Families are funny and families are interesting. And I've actually, luckily, I have a very big family. I'm one of 5 siblings, and both my parents are still living. And so I've done all their genes. I've done all their genetic blueprints because what do you do when you start something, right? You test it on your family. And what is very fascinating to me is there are similarities, but there are big differences, just even in like siblings that are 2 years apart because of what we talked about earlier, which is the impact that is had in the mother's womb and the grandmother's womb, right? And what is going on, particularly when the mother is carrying the child. And so even 2 years, 4 years after my mom carried me, there were different factors going on in her life, right? And we can see that. Of course, we can't say like, "Oh, that's exactly where it came from. That must have been it, mom, when you went to that party and got exposed to whatever." No, that's not how it works. But what's fascinating is that, yes, like we can look at it and we can even compare like, oh, yeah, we're all pretty prone to insulin resistance. Like, that's a pretty common trait that is very much like, it's kind of stays in families, right? The the bad genes, which I'll talk about. It's a very common and popular set of genes,
You're
and
not saying bad genes.
nope,
When you say
GAD. Yep, yep, there are no bad genes.
somebody has bad
GAD.
genes.
No one has bad genes. They're all good. They're all genes. The GAD genes, GAD, this refers to our individual grain sensitivity. And why this is common among families is because there's only a set of a few of them that impact this particular sensitivity. So some panels, you'll see like dozens of genes that go into that. So, right, you take the average of that and it's like all of those are impacting that area. Well, this is just a set of GAD genes that impact your grain sensitivity. And what we're really talking about are those SNPs that correspond to the body's ability to convert glutamate into GABA. And they're both neurotransmitters. And so glutamate is involved in every major excitatory brain function, right? So when we have excess glutamate, it can cause anxiety, agitation, difficulty sleeping, gut distress. Leaky gut can even be a cause of this. In extreme cases, it can cause, depression and like a lot of things that do affect families, especially if we're all in the same boat of this grain sensitivity, this glutamate sensitivity. And so when the glutamate is super high, and this is what I'm seeing a lot of in clients' lives, when the glutamate is super high, it actually reduces our GABA. It reduces our ability to convert that into GABA. So when our GABA is low, the gamma aminobutyric acid is what that is. And then it's for short GABA. That is actually what gives us that calming effect. And it can lessen anxiety and stress, promote better sleep. It creates like sensory processing and just like integration. And so when our body is out of balance and we're not able to convert that well, you can imagine how somebody is feeling, right? But you're really not able to put your finger on that just without seeing that those genetic markers. You can't really quantify that from another type of testing. Like, oh yeah, I guess I have a problem converting glutamate. It's hard to really identify that. And so when people are seeing that, they're really able to kind of look at their lifestyle through a lens of, okay, where do I start? How do I start reducing glutamate? And I have a whole guide on that for clients that end up in this camp because in families in particular, just speaking on the families that I have done that with, even husband and wives that aren't blood related, like they'll do it. One person may have it, one person may not, but you want the information to be able to support each other on that journey of reducing that. And that's a really fascinating one. There's another one that's really popular because of there was a documentary done, Limitless. Have you seen that?
Common, not popular, right?
No,
Want it.
we do not want it, right? Yeah, it's not desirable. Let's say that. It's not desirable. It's very common though. And common in families because it refers to the ApoE genes and the ApoE status, which correlates with how somebody is impacted by saturated fat in the diet over time. And over time, this directly affects potential health impacts. So think cognitive impacts and think heart-related impacts. This directly refers to the plaque buildup that can result in the arteries over time. And so, of course, with not giving medical advice and not being a doctor, these are things we do not want to happen later in life. And these are things that we unfortunately have seen in our families. My own grandmother specifically, I just know because she started to have cognitive decline very early on in her life. And, she left this earth very young. And I didn't do her genes. I wasn't in this work then. I didn't know. So there's no way for me to confirm that. But knowing what I know about my own family's genes and knowing what I know about epigenetics and how that impacts, she came over to America from the Philippines when my mom was 2 months old. Like her lifestyle had drastically changed from the way she was living in the Philippines and then coming to America, knowing nothing about this country and having to learn English and all of that. and then becoming totally engrossed in the diet culture, basically, that she got sucked into. And yeah, it's crazy because it really does affect generations. And knowing that information gives us the ability to also impact our kids and their kids from so many generations. Yeah.
I want to call out before we move on that we've got multiple scientific references from PubMed and other places that if you want to di- dive a little deeper into some of the things that Becca is referring to, that you can find them all in the show note references. We'll put all of those there for you. And also, I want to remind you, we did so many of those references as we dove deep in the science part of it in 499 as well. Um, okay, so another one that I'm assuming is common is MTHFR. That's one
Mm.
even like my regular family physician tested me
Yeah.
for.
Yes.
And I have both variants. There's two,
Yeah.
right?
There's
Yeah.
2. Yeah, there's multiple. And so some people think that there's just the one and they're like, "Oh, I have MTHFR." There's a couple, and it's really interesting because they're very high impact. And so some genes hold more weight than others, right? Some genes are very high impact and some genes have an impact, but not as hefty. So these genes are responsible for both dopamine production and methylation activity. So we talked about what that looks like with alcohol and how you methylate alcohol and other things. It also, or don't. And then, yes, in most of our cases, right, I'm not a good methylator either. It's a very low methylation, sorry, status over here. And dopamine production. And dopamine production is important because that kind of crosses a lot of different levels. We see dopamine coming into play when it comes to hunger and satiety. We see dopamine coming into play when it comes to sleep. We see dopamine coming into play when it comes to the way we detox. And so, and just our behaviors too. It's interesting when we see over methylators and under methylators and actually the correlation with how we are wired personality wise. You know, over methylators have certain tendencies, under methylators have certain tendencies. And I always like to tell people when I'm pointing out that section that this is a good thing. Like you're like, because you are a high achiever, like very ritualistic person, very much like competitive, like that you are that way, partly because of your methylation status. So you can kind of give people, I know, right, Stacey? I just blew your mind.
You know those things about me. But also, what?
Yeah, it's a set of traits. And so what's cool is when I go through that methylation status, which is deeply impacted by the MTHFR and other genes, I'm able to tell people that, like, do you relate to any of these? And if I know them, then I know how they are, but I let them kind of tell me a little bit about themselves and find out about them and, go over their client intake form and really see like how they're wired, how they go about life, their professional achievements, the way they are. Like, I mean, I think it's silly, but even kind of like their Enneagram. I know that sounds funny, but like it's not a surprise to me that like certain people with certain Enneagram numbers are also a certain methylation status, which you wouldn't know unless you knew about both. So it's just kind of interesting. And then, of course, like we all come to the table with different family situations. We all come to the table from different places. And I think that a lot of people, kind of have that thing in their mind, like maybe I should look into epigenetic testing. Like what would that look like? And I think people generally fall into two different camps here. And of course, this is very general. There's a lot of in between, but usually it's a person like me, right? And you that has basically done it all. Like we've done it all, functional medicine test, protocol after protocol. We've dove into our health. We've learned about our bodies over the years, and they maybe are sitting there knowing that something still isn't right, right? Maybe hopefully they're coming from it as a place of like, okay, I want to dive into this from a place of love, but you may be like me and you may be thinking like there's something wrong with my body, right? Some of us are there and we just have to own that. That person who's in that camp, or is really tired of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what will stick. They might have a family history of things that they want to avoid. The symptoms might be as simple as stress and anxiety, right? Very much air quoting simple because that is not simple. Stress and anxiety are not simple, very complex. Or they might have a family history of some of those things that we talked about, like heart related or cognitive related functions that they're trying to say, I don't want to go through that. I don't want my children to have to go through what I went through with my parents or my grandparents or loved ones around me. And while the genetic array that we do isn't deterministic, right? We talked about that. It's rather, probabilistic. So it's a probability, it's a propensity, it's a likelihood. It gives you key insights on where you are going, like where you are headed. And this type of information can make lasting impacts on generations because of what we know about that, the epigenetic changes and the inheritance that happens transgenerationally. Like, we have talked about that. You guys have dove deep on that in that episode that you did. And there's a whole lot of us who kind of fall in between, right? Like, some of us are just trying to figure out what's going on with us. Some of us are really trying to make that lasting impact for our generations to come. And then a lot of us are in between and we just want to figure out what we look like what we're wired like. My oldest son loves to play video games. And so I like to tell him and other people I've done his dreams as well. And I'm like, it's the cheat codes to your body. It's basically like having your body's cheat codes because you do get information that kind of helps you to shortcut some of the things that you may have tried and trial and error approach for a long time before you figured it out.
Cheat codes to your body is the title of the show now.
Love
Um,
it.
so I, first of all, like, I could talk about this forever because I'm so fascinated. And I'm also like gonna be reaching out to do this for myself, which I don't often like try to do more of these things because I find that it really does pull me into kind of that diet culture mindset. But
Yeah.
I trust you, Becca. So I feel like we can
Oh,
look at
I
my
love
genes and
that.
I
Absolutely.
you'd be like, Stacey, this is why you're an Enneagram 8 competitive. Like that's it's just fascinating to me. And I also
So,
think that I want to remind listeners that there are things that I'm sure come up. So tell me if I'm wrong about this, Becca, but I'm gonna assume that as a mother who's looked at the genes of your children, that there are some things that hit you in your heart like, "Oh, I'm responsible for that," or
yeah.
guilt or whatever it might be, and this is just my reminder to everyone that this is in no way intended to be or, should ever be considered a way for you to have regret or shame or anything like that about the choices in the life that you live if you've already kind of had children and can point to like I can think right now to the fact that when I got pregnant with Cole, it was not planned and those first couple of months were not ideal. And you know what? He's here. And he, you know what I mean? Like I can't change anything about that.
Yep.
And I wouldn't change
Mhm.
having him in my life for anything. And living with kind of guilt or shame, looking at anything that might be in his genetics and pointing to like, "Oh, that's probably because, whatever." That's not gonna do me any good if I go down this spiral of negativity, nor would it do me any good if I looked at my genes and held responsibility for the generations before me. Like, all parents are doing the best that they can with the information and the resources that they can, and that's why we know in the 499 episode, we also talked about not just epigenetics, but also social determinants of health because they really do play together in terms of if you don't have access to things, if you live in a super stressful, high toxic environment, all of these kinds of things, it's going to affect your epigenetics, your genetics. And ultimately, that is why marginalized groups have this like snowball of badness that is so difficult for those groups to kind of escape because it is truly ingrained in their DNA and in all of these kinds of ways, not just socially, but from those social determinants, it goes into their DNA. So, all of that to say, I want to make sure that all of our listeners, as they're hearing this and they're thinking about the life life that they've lived or the choices that they've made or these kinds of things and the impact that it has on our children. I mean, currently we just watched a movie from like the 1960s where everyone who was pregnant was having martinis and drinking cigarettes, right? Like
Right.
I mean, like, those moms were not thinking that it was, like, affecting their children. We all do the best that we can with the knowledge
Yeah,
that we have, and so
absolutely.
just don't use this as a
Mm-mm.
method to criticize yourself.
No, yeah.
That said, I do always like to leave people with something positive. So I feel like, let's move out of this, like, any sort of negative mindset someone might have into ways that we can kind of implement actionable suggestions that people
Okay.
can take and to be of service to work on themselves. I know we've talked about a lot of practical examples that you've seen when you're working with clients and they start implementing some of these things and supporting their bodies based on the results. And because it's bio individual, it's not like you can say, well, in general, everyone should do blah, blah, blah. And I feel like, honestly, if you ever hear anyone say that, like,
Run.
it's a red flag.
I always say, if you hear one size fits all advice, like just run the other way. Cause unfortunately, that's how I feel. Or unfortunately, that's what it is. But yeah, I love what you just said. And I love like moving to the positive space. And I will tell you, like, from my heart to yours, that we always focus on the positive, and there's never a time, like, I've done a lot of moms and their children's reports in the same family, and there's never a time where we ever go over anything on the report in a way of, you need to change something about your child, and or you need to change anything that you've done in the past, or that you even need to think about it at all, because that is the kind of the silver lining with this is, no matter what is on the report, like, we really cannot pinpoint why. Like, it just is one of those things. Like, I cannot tell you why my ApoE status is the way that it is. Like, I couldn't say, like, maybe my mom did this. No, it's not even a thought that crosses our mind, because all we're looking at is like how we're wired and what we can move forward with. And I'm always going to take that positive, like, forward thinking spin when it comes to it. And I have a lot of moms who will do their kids' reports and their kids aren't on the call. Like, you're getting the information on your kid because you're the gatekeeper of your house, and you make decisions for your household and you do with it what you will. And then when your child is old enough to really sink the information in and like really get that information from a place of like, I want to learn about my body, not what is wrong with me, then you can have that mature conversation with your child. So I would like to say that before I give the
And
the
then
closing
and
thought.
and then when they're in high school, they will ignore it all, do the exact opposite
First,
of what is best for them.
which
And
makes them a teenager.
right, exactly. And then you can just like remind yourself, it's fine. They'll be
It's
fine.
fine.
I
It's
did
fine.
worse.
They'll be fine. And I'm right there with you. Like, my oldest, I didn't know I was pregnant with him until I was about 12 weeks along. And so I'm like, there were some questionable choices that happened, but you cannot hold yourself to a gold standard of like perfection. Like, that's not real. And I will 100% be coming to you for teenage advice soon, because mine's 12 almost. And I'm like, we're getting there.
Okay.
But yeah, and
So
so
these general positive things, what are they?
general positive things. So, changes that I've seen in my clients after implementing and supporting their bodies from seeing what's on their genetic blueprint consistently are just improvement of energy, right? Like, energy levels go up when we give our body what it's looking for, when we give our body what it's wired for. Balanced blood sugar is a great side effect of treating your body with what it needs, because really a lot of people, you know, aren't paying attention to that. And when we start to pay attention to it, it can look very easy, and it can look very exciting in your life. It doesn't have to look restrictive to support these areas, right? And I always teach my clients, like, no restriction. It's definitely about having fun with the information that you have. There's an overall sense of feeling balanced, a lot of brain fog and anxiety being improved. I feel like just a lot of my clients come to me with that. And I can relate to that. For many years, I just was living in a constant state of like low level, borderline anxiety all the time, and kind of thought that was just my personality trait, right? Until I realized it was directly affected by some of the genes that I had. And then the ability to support themselves with the tools that they will know to help them, instead of listening to those well meaning wellness noise out there. And again, this is not a knock on any advice that is given. It is just a statement of the biggest impact that I've seen from people doing their genetic blueprints is the fact that now they know what works for them, instead of having to figure out and filter through everything that's out there. In myself, I have seen a huge shift in the way that I approach nutrition, because we could do a whole episode on my whole history with diet culture, and from a very young age, But we won't go there. We can just say that it's been this huge healing transformation of looking at my nutrition and looking at my body from a place of love and not from a place of punishment. And that was a huge thing for me because I mean, I feel like I was younger than my oldest son now when I started paying attention to diets. And that was a huge shift as a mid-30s woman to go, okay, I no longer see food as something that I have to control. Like, even with all the information I have, I see food as nourishing. I see food as a tool to make me feel good. And that sometimes includes ice cream and pizza and all of the things that I love. Like, my genes gave me permission to still have all the things that I love, which I thought was great. Anxiety, sleep, those were my big, huge things. Energy levels, those are all the things that I had been suffering with for years, ever since I had my daughter, and didn't know why until I learned about how to treat my body. And a lot of that was with huge respect and just knowledge. The GAD gene panel, GAD, totally changed my life because it's such a high impact panel. Because my thing is that I was doing all the things that I thought were cool and trendy and putting collagen in my coffee and like having all these like wellness like kombuchas and bone broths and all these things that like, oh, everybody says you have to do it. And then when I dove into like, oh, all of those things are high in glutamate and I'm high dosing myself with glutamate every day. Hang on. Do I have to do those things? Do I need to do those things every day? Or did I just think that I had to because they were healthy? And so when I had not only the mindset shift, but realized I wasn't actually doing them because I enjoyed them, like I didn't want to put collagen powder in my coffee every day. I just did it because, like, yeah, you have to do it.
Because Stacy said it made her feel better.
Well, you know what? And I've said a lot of things have made me feel better in the past, including that. I was telling people all about collagen powder. I was telling people all about, like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I make bone broth all the time. And again, I'm not knocking bone broth. It's just not the best thing for me. A 16-hour bone broth. I will make a 2-hour bone broth. But again, there's all these different tricks and tips that you can learn about yourself. That was my biggest light bulb moment was that many of the common wellness trends that I was following at the time, just because I thought they would work for me, were actually like contradictive to what my genes were saying. And that made me feel really good that I was learning about what would truly work for me. So it gave me that freedom. Like many of my clients, they just feel that sense of freedom and now can kind of tune in to what they know will best support them in their own unique genetic makeup. Cause you said it best. It's bio individual. It's not going to be like, I have a very strict policy of like, I do not recommend things unless I see your genes when it comes to certain categories.
And that makes
So,
a lot
yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for listeners, if you're unfamiliar with glutamate, because I know when Becca and I were preparing the notes, I was looking at what this is and heard the term a bunch, but still like not exactly sure. Too much glutamate symptoms would be something like anxiety, depression, restlessness, inability to concentrate, headaches, insomnia, fatigue, and increased sensitivity to pain. So if you have a genetic disposition to, if you're wired that glutamate is not something that you process well, that's what the GAD gene panel is telling you, right? You're not
Mhm.
processing it well,
Yeah.
then you're going to end up with too much glutamate in your system and end up with some of those symptoms. So, for example, some of those high glutamate foods would be, as Becca just mentioned, collagen, but also soy sauce, aged cheeses,
Jesus. Yeah.
seaweed, mushrooms, tomato sauce, and then MSG, which I don't think a
Mhm.
lot of us are consuming on a regular basis. But, all of those foods are foods that we can look at and say have nutritional benefit to a diet, right? Like seaweed and mushrooms in particular, I think we've talked about many times in the show as having incredible nutritive power. And at the same time, if you're wired for those things to be too much for you, they can actually create some of the negative symptoms that you might be experiencing and not realize that it's related. Might be consuming more and more mushrooms, mushroom coffee, mushroom all the things. Like I'm
Yeah.
imagining someone right now with their mushroom coffee, putting collagen in it, and then having this GAD gene issue, right? And I'm like, "Oh gosh."
Yeah.
So, I love the idea of kind of being in control of this and not kind of trying to figure it out all on your own. And also the idea that you can also be aware that, like, okay, well, that's what my genes say. And I really enjoy soy sauce. I'm still going to have it. I'm just going to be aware that when I have large quantities of it, I'm not going to feel my best. So I'm going to be on the lookout for some of these symptoms that might tell me, okay, now I need to like curb back on something. I'm
Yeah.
all about empowerment. So,
Absolutely. Empowerment is key. And the list is long with the glutamate. And I give all my clients kind of a glutamate guide if they fall in that spectrum. And what I tell them is like, there's going to be a lot of conflicting information online. There's going to be a lot of information online. So what I've done is I've taken my research with the genes, I've taken my own like experience and then clients' experience and kind of given them a guide, so to speak, to what that looks like, how to like limit that in their life. And also, just like you said, let's take mushrooms, for example. Like mushrooms, like if you love mushrooms and like you cut out the other things, like keep the mushrooms. Like we're not going to be 100% glutamate free. And also the good news is that mushroom coffee, as long as it comes from like the spores, like the reishi, they're good to go. Like you don't have to worry about that unless it's the ones you buy at the grocery store. But and you'll see improvements. And you can also improve your tolerance over time when you start to cut these things out and really improve your tolerance. And then at the same time, like there is a whole list of things that help your body to clear excess. So I'm all about like, hey, I'm going on vacation. I know I'm going to be eating like a bunch of like corn. I know I'm going to be eating a bunch of like, I want to have like oat milk, everything for some reason. And I just want to go green, like heavy. What can I do? Like there's tools you could take with you. There's, like a bunch of really cool, like even just certain magnesiums that can help to counteract the excitatory effects of it. There's, different teas you can drink. There's really neat things that you can do from working with your blueprint that's not just oh, sorry, can't have mushrooms. Like, you're so right. It can't be like that. It's all about empowerment.
and the idea of supporting your body's own natural detoxification process is also something I'm all about. So here we are once again, Becca and I, eye to eye. And listeners, if you want to hear more, we'll be sharing what we really thought over on patreon.com/the whole view, which is the best place to ask questions as well. If you love the show that we create and produce ourselves, the Patreon is a great way to support the show, but so is leaving a review and hitting follow or subscribe in whatever podcast app that you're using so that others can find us as well. And if you want to find Becca, I want to remind you, you can find her at mindbodygenes.com and at mindbodygenes on all social channels. I follow you on Instagram. Where else are you?
Yep. I'm on Facebook, but Instagram is where I hang out the most. So definitely there.
Yes. Well, I'm assuming you're a millennial as well.
Yep.
We're
I am.
stuck on Instagram.
We're stuck on Instagram.
But Becca also does, as she mentioned, specific coaching and also has a self-paced course. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I do. I work one on one with clients as well as sometimes do group containers. I have a really cool thing, a self paced course in something I call Mind Body Academy because it's all connected, as you know. And it's basically how to refresh and reset your energy through epigenetics and energetics. So we take not only epigenetic principles, but even if you haven't gotten your blueprint and don't know your genes yet, we talk about some very cool but approachable biohacks and approachable energetic shifts that you can make when it comes to mindset, when it comes to the way that we're treating our bodies and different things like meditations. It has it all. It covers the gamut. And no matter where you're at in your healing journey, if you feel like you could need a reset and a refresh on your energy, which I know we all can from time to time, I made a special code for you guys and you can use that. Any of the whole view listeners, it's TWV. You use that code for $100 off the course. It is your step-by-step guide to optimizing your energy and your vitality, and then kind of hitting some of those subconscious mind techniques and manifestation tools as well, because that you can never have enough of those.
Well, I will be utilizing the secondary offer, which you're including, which is to take that $100 off the genetic blueprint package.
Yep.
So you can email Becca at mindbodyjanes.com if you want to learn more about either one of these options. But code TWV to get $100 off. I'm sure if they just mention hearing you on the whole view, that also works as well if they're
Absolutely.
emailing you.
Yep. If you email me any package you want to book, you guys get a discount. I'm so excited.
And we'll put those links in the show notes for you. We've also put a list of all the resources and scientific references at realeverything.com as well. Listeners, I'm going to thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate your willingness to be open and grow through your own personal change. No one is perfect. Hopefully, you realize we don't want you to be. But in listening, learning, and unlearning, we can all become better versions of ourselves. So, thank you for being here today. And Becca, thank you for being here today and telling us all about all this fun science. We're
Thank
big geeks
you.
on the show, as you know. So, thanks for
I love
letting us
it.
geek out with you today.
Thank you for having me.